The incense is going. This is a Blaze One If You Got One video. My wife has pushed me to do content for the black box. She's like, look, you need to get content for the black box. So let's do content for the black box. For my lefty audience of Progressive Soapbox, this is a Blaze One If You Got One. No one has really asked me how I got into this kind of thing, the trippy, the weird, the woo-woo stuff. Why am I interested in that? I'm interested in it because of the experiences that I've had over the course of my life that have pushed me to question what this is. It's one thing to believe something. As hard as you want, you can try to convince yourself of all sorts of things, but it's another thing to touch it. The catch here is the moment that you touch it, you're still left with questions, but at the very least, you've touched it and you have somewhat of a stone of understanding, even if you have no idea what it means. I'm going to go into some of my experiences, and this is going to be content for the black box. Welcome to the black box. My name is Jamarl Thomas. This is the Black Box. And yeah, I'm going to recount some of my experiences. Each one is going to be a video unto itself. There's going to be other content on the Black Box, but at the very least, we can start here about how I got into it, why I'm interested in the subject matter. This is going to be out of order, and I'm going to start at my first consciously induced OBE. Blaze one if you got one. Leave your kind of, that's not right, all this other stuff at the door, and let's just kind of indulge. I make no bones about what this is. I'm only explaining to you what I've experienced. All of these things are actual experiences in each of the videos. There's no hedge or there's no push on it. And again, if I'm being honest, with a lifetime of experiences starting even when I was a child, I am no further in understanding what the hell this is. Even though I kind of get where people are coming from, where they come up with these religious stuff to explain it. I have no idea. But I will tell you my experiences. Some of them are cool, some of them are weird, some of them freak me the hell out. At the very least, I'll start with you with one that started to freak me out, and it ended up being a process, not necessarily a specific thing that took place. My first consciously induced OBE. So, my wife, Mrs. Thomas, is a long-suffering woman. She ends up with a husband that goes through certain phases in his life where he gets immensely involved in something for a long period of time, and he has to just kind of work it out. And she has to kind of deal while he's immensely engaged in this. Now, sometimes this is positive, like, doing a show where you're spending 6 hours after working 8 hours a day. And other times it freaks her out, like when during my period where I started going through, I need to understand this UFO stuff. It was random. It just kind of happened. And in just kind of happening, it happened all at once, and it was all consuming of, is there reality to this? Is it legit? And if it is legit, I need to understand it. Now, this happened to me once before when I was younger, around when I was 18 years old, and I came across this thing of spirit guides. At one time, Montel Williams used to have a show, and psychic Sylvia Brown used to be on that show. And Sylvia Brown used to talk about a spirit guide all the time, and I thought, there's no fucking way. I probably would have been an atheist if it wasn't for the experiences that I've had in life, because I was somewhat of a skeptical SOB. But my thing was, if it's real, I should be able to validate it. And Brown, to her credit, put out a book on how to contact your own spirit guide. To her credit, because she didn't have to do this. She could have just said, oh, trust me, you have to just believe me that this is the way things are. I took that book. I went through that book. My rule is try it. Regardless of how weird or strange it sounds. I remember Tom Campbell was talking about when he got the job for Barbara and Monroe. And their thing was, no matter what it is, no matter how strange it is, try it. There's some people that think are outright lunatics. But I don't necessarily think everybody is a lunatic. People have their own belief systems, and their belief systems harden them to other possibilities. My thing was, I have no idea what reality is. And even at that point, I had enough weird experiences for me to at the very least be open to, I'll try it. I went through her meditative stuff. And what I found was that I had a fear quotient. That I would get to the point where it would feel like I would plug into an electrical outlet. And this took like a month or so, maybe 2 or 3 months. I would feel like I was plugged into an electrical outlet And I would get to the point where I would feel like I was hitting a horizon or something. It would freak me out. And it would freak me out to the point where I would force myself out of the state to stop it. This went on for months. I would always hit the point where I would get scared and I would stop. Until one day, I got tired of being afraid. I was more curious than not. And I ended up letting it happen. And I heard a voice in the room saying, hello. I said hello in my head. I heard a verbal voice inside my bed said, hello. I didn't get freaked out by this, by the way. I was living alone. There was nobody else in the house. I didn't get freaked out by this. If anything, I got more excited by this because it would meant that to some degree what she was saying was right. The very next night, in a lucid state where I was somewhere else, I knew I had a body somewhere else, I interacted with a woman who explained that she was my expositor. I had no idea what that word meant. And she continued in a certain series of tests. I mean, this is a whole video by itself. But needless to say, that woman has been with me every so often through various points of my life. When I was younger, more so. But it was enough for me to be like, okay, my understanding of reality is off. And at that moment, I became more New Agey. As I got older, I became less New Agey. And I became more so into the camp of, I have no idea what this is. Because of those experiences, I've had a strong, I don't want to call it a hole, but this thing of wanting to know what that is. And this immense drive to not just wanting to know what it is, wanting to regain contact with her to some degree, because there were multiple contacts over the course of my life. Less so as I got older. Why am I saying this within the context of the OB? Many of the experiences that I had when I was younger were lucid. They were outside of my control. After meeting the guide for the first time, I went on this for years, having random lucid states that I couldn't necessarily control. I would just end up in a state. I would have a body somewhere else. I would be there. I could interact. I could talk. Sometimes you interact with other people. Sometimes you can call things to you, which is kind of one of the other times I met one of my other guides. But again, those are separate stories. Those are separate videos. My point is this. Those were uncontrolled. I had no power in that process. The reality was a little bit more malleable, but I had no power. I would just end up there. I have a body somewhere. I'm here. And I couldn't necessarily always control how long I stayed in those states. When I fell out those states, it's almost like you died there. The senses and everything else got to just drain away. And bam, you're back here in another conscious state. Another body, still talking, still walking. Same thing. You keep it moving. I wanted to have a conscious OBE. And from my understanding, everything that people were saying, at least all the literature that I was reading, had a conscious element component to the alien issue. Meaning, it's one thing to read stuff, it's another thing to experience. And my thing was, there are people out here who are saying they're making contact. How are they doing it? Are they insane? Or is there an element of truth to this? And if there's an element of truth to it, how do you validate it? Meaning, is there any way to validate what they're saying when they're talking about this context stuff? What I found was ultimately there were some people who were lunatics. Let's pull those people to the side. There were other people who were less so. There were other people in South America that's been doing this for like 100 years. There's some people in the US that's appropriated the stuff that they were doing in South America. And the interesting component here is similar processes for guide stuff and contact stuff. And if you're starting off from the New Agey part, you'll see it right away. You could literally take off alien, and what they're saying is almost identical. It's fucking fascinating. The people in the process never asked this question of, well, wait a minute, what's the New Agey component? Part of the reason that I had Grant Cameron on the show was because Grant Cameron talks about the consciousness component to the entire process, this phenomenology. Ding, ding. I was able to do it when I was a kid. Can I do it now? And not randomly, but consciously. Meaning the first step into the process would be, I would imagine, a OBE state, a non-waking state of consciousness. So the goal was a non-waking state of consciousness. How do you do it? At that point, I started saying, all right, this guy talking about sunbathing feels a little stupid, but okay. And so tried that. Somebody else said, look, you could force your body into certain states using certain herbal meds and certain vitamins. And there were certain vitamins that would have this thing of making your dreams more lucid, making your dreams more vivid. Okay, let's start there. Maybe we can start remembering our dreams. Maybe we can start, like, it's this kind of step-by-step process of trying to evaluate if this is working or not, if there is any legitimacy to it or not, and can you get something from it. My thing was, I don't want to go to sleep, because if you go to sleep in a process, you might just be dreaming. And you need to be able to pull something from the process to give it a certain degree of legitimacy where you could say, this is information that I didn't have before I went into the process. Otherwise, there's no way to tag it. Even now, I look at all my experience and I say my consciousness can be screwing with me. I end up in the position that I don't know. It's unsatisfying to some degree, and yet you touch something, so you know something is there, even if you don't know what something is. I got to the point where my goal was to have the body to go to sleep while not going to sleep yourself. That was my objective. To have the body to go to sleep without you going to sleep, meaning this mind, this consciousness. To have it that usually floats and rides with the body itself, to no longer have the body itself to be attached to. Now, this ended up with a lot of meditative stuff. And it freaked my wife out. And she would be like, look, I understand what you're trying to accomplish. I don't necessarily buy into it. And to be honest, I didn't fully buy into it either. And she says, however, just know that you have somebody else here, that just in case, on the off chance that that shit ends up being real, that my black ass is not taken with you. Fair enough. I understand where you're coming from. Sometimes I was doing this meditative stuff by myself. But what I ended up getting to the point was, after maybe a few months, I got to the point where I could be in a sleeping state, or getting to the point of where your body nods off. And ultimately, this took a while. I mean, because ultimately you're laying somewhere for a long period of time, maybe like 30 minutes or so. And it gets to the point where your body just says, all right, he's not moving. I'm assuming he's asleep. And it clicks off. When it clicks off like that, sometimes the conscious mind is able to hang on. And when it hangs on, you realize the body's asleep. You would go through this thing where sometimes people feel like something is on their back. They talk about hag and everything else, or that they can't move. That's the state that you're aiming for. That was the state that I was aiming for. I wanted to get to the point where I could no longer move, even though I myself was still conscious. Your body does this because it doesn't want you to have a bad dream and jump off the bed and jump out of a window or something. This takes a while. It finally gets to the point where it starts. On this particular day, it starts. I get to the point where I realize my body is shutting off. My eyes are closed and everything else. And I start hearing stuff. I'm wide awake. I haven't lost consciousness. And I start hearing like these, it sounds like a vacuum cleaner. It's like it's really loud. And it freaks me out. And I punk up and I stop. Being honest, I got scared. Like, it's freaky. You're laying in a room, you're by yourself. I already have this thing about being in the dark by myself since I was a kid. And you're there by yourself. It's pitch black and you're hearing stuff. You're wide awake. You haven't lost consciousness at all. Imagine if you're just sitting in a room, you're just like hearing stuff. But imagine that with your eyes closed. Eventually, I try this again. I get to a similar process. The sounds start again. And, the most pain in the ass thing about this is it takes forever to get to the state. So punking out is somewhat of a pain in the ass. It happens. It starts to happen. The state starts to happen. Eyes are closed. By myself in the house. I start hearing a vacuum cleaner in both ears. Loud. Shushing. Extremely loud sounds. And as those sounds get louder and louder and louder, I get to the point where it starts to like I'm hearing a voice. Now, immediately at this point, again, I had this pain of contact for my guide, this thing that used to take place when I was young, and I thought to myself, wow, is this it? Like, am I getting to the point where I'm hitting some kind of barrier? And I'm listening intently on this. Now, the catch here is hearing the loud sound in and of itself. Your brain starts to fashion it around certain things. The sound was just a sound. Your conscious mind was trying to fashion it into something. It's just sound. This loud, shushing sound. The secondary thing that started to happen was it felt like my heart was going to beat on my chest. It felt like my heart was beating 1,000 times a minute. It literally felt like I was going to have a heart attack. And just from my reading on this, because I had been reading on this stuff for years, even up to the point of trying this, I knew that there's like an energy thing. It's almost like their explanation is your energetic body is forming. And not just necessarily forming, you're just becoming aware of it, if that makes sense. It's not anything that's being created, per se. It's more so that your mind is being focused on something else outside of the waking state. Your senses are loud. And because your senses are loud, those are the things that you tend to focus on. Not to mention you tend to juice it up with alcohol and coffee and cigarettes and pot, etc., etc. At this particular moment, you're being aware of something that you weren't aware of before. And the conscious experience of that is, oh my God, I'm about to have a heart attack. Everything feels like it's charged. That moment when I was younger, where I felt like I stuck my hand into an outlet when I was trying to contact the guy, that barrier is like 1,000, it's that times 1,000. It's intense, it's extremely intense. And I started to punk out, and at that moment I started to tell myself, don't do it. Don't be a punk. Don't bitch out. Don't be a bitch. Do it. And it gets to a point where the sound gets to somewhat of a ruckus cacophony. It gets to somewhat of a fever pitch. This feeling gets to somewhat of a fever pitch. And then kind of like, bam, you're in a different place, state. You're still there. Don't misunderstand me. But that stuff stops. And I'm sitting there, and I'm aware. I'm just kind of like, you're feeling it. You're like, all right, what's this? But I realize I'm staring at the ceiling. Now, the catch here is my eyes are closed. And from a technical sense, my body is asleep. I am wide awake. I'm aware. At no point did I break consciousness. At this point, however, despite my eyes being closed, I'm staring at the ceiling. And I'm in this kind of... There are a few things that are happening. I'm telling myself, this sounds stupid, but don't think of a monster that's going to eat you. And I understand that the very act of saying don't think about the monster that's going to eat you is the exact same thing I'm thinking about the monster that's going to eat you. My issue is trying to keep pretty much any other thought at bay that just kind of exists and try to understand where I was and what was taking place without necessarily letting a fear quotient edge into the process. And I get it, the very point of trying to not let fear edge into the process to some degree. But at that point, I was doing a pretty decent job. But I'm laying there looking at the ceiling. And it occurs to me, oh my God, I'm looking at the ceiling. My eyes are closed. I'm looking at the ceiling. There's something else. How am I looking at the ceiling? My eyes are closed. And it feels different. Slightly. It feels different. It feels like you're in a different spot. At that point, I'm like, all right, I'm good. That's what I literally, I'm good. Because it took right a bit of thought to overcome the fear part. Fear is a big issue, man. It creeps in. The problem is, because the experiences are so odd, like if you think about your way of growing up, you experience one thing after the next, and you get over those things. It becomes so common, it's so normal that dog that you see every day is just a normal dog. It's in your head as a regular dog. The cat that you see, that's a lion, that's a bear, that's a tiger, that's a this, that's a that, that's a car. You have all of these associations with all of these things, and you're infinitely familiar with these things because you encounter these things on a daily basis. But what about stuff you don't encounter on a daily basis? As an adult, do you think you would encounter it with any more bravado? You won't. It's an experience. And in my case, it's, at least in my mind, to acclimate yourself to it just by repeated access. Meaning, what you start off as being scared with, if you do it over and over and over again, at a certain point, it becomes old hand, just like your experiences here. There's stuff that freaked me out, don't get me wrong. But over the course of my life, there's been enough stuff where the freak out faction becomes somewhat less and less and less, just because you've been encountering the stuff more and more and more, just over the course of your life. That experience was rewarding. That was absolute, like, it's hard to get across. It's one thing to talk about it. It's another thing, or even to believe it. And for the longest time, I had been reading the literature on that stuff without actually trying to do it. But at that point, I had a goal and I had a perspective in mind that I wanted to accomplish. The goal was, A, to validate whether or not it existed. I already thought it existed. This state exists. The other thing was, what can you do in that state? And to try to kind of explore that particular thing. I never got to that point. There were other things that pulled me away. Like I told you, I get pulled into this place and that place. My interest in the UFO stuff never went away. The intensity of it edged off to some degree. And I started finding other modes of contact. In fact, not just other modes of contact. The stuff started getting really weird. It started freaking my wife out. But nevertheless, that was my first conscious OBE. It took several months. But the biggest quotient of that, honestly, the hardest part of that, was trying to find something that worked for me, because I don't sleep all that well. And so I have a hard time even getting into the state of doing it. And at this point, my sleep had gotten worse. So at this point, it was even that much harder. But getting into the state was probably one of the hardest parts. Laying there for the longest, for all of that time period and not doing anything, not moving, not budging an inch. But that was, to me, the easiest way of getting to that particular point. Not falling asleep is not the easiest thing in the world. And again, that's one of those things I would imagine just takes practice. Sometimes you just get it lucky into a sweet spot. There are other techniques on this. One of the techniques is waking up early in the morning at like 4 in the morning and then getting back in bed, and you have just the right amount of like brain chemicals in a right disposition of wakefulness versus sleepiness, where you can kind of get into a nice head state. Look, it's to the individual. Some people have been massively good at this and have done amazing research in this particular area. I didn't get the aliens. I wasn't good enough at it, or at the very least, I couldn't continuously repeat the state over and over and over again in the way some people could. But it's there. I could hit it when I was unconscious, but conscious OB is a little bit harder to do for me. But it's there, and I would imagine if I got into that mindset of let's pull that off, it's probably doable. So I am going to keep the first 3 minutes of this video here. The remainder of this video is going to be on Black Box. Look, the OBE stuff is fascinating, and the research on that stuff is amazing. And some of the people, like Robert Monroe, there's another gentleman that's on YouTube that's extremely good. I've had 2 or 3 of his books on it. Look, they don't know. Like, honestly, the only thing they can do is literally report, this is what I've experienced, and based on my experience, this is what I think it is. And Black Box is literally that. This is my experience. I can only report what I experienced. Some of this stuff is just odd phenomena. Some of it has been when I was absolutely lucid and awake without any, just entirely aware. No secondary states or anything else. Some of it, not so much. Some of it takes place with information I don't have in advance. But what I will recount to you are my experiences. I would even give you my speculation on what it is in that sense. But I have to be honest. You're stuck in the same situation that all of these other people are, with just being able to recount the experience without necessarily being able to get into the underlying thing. You have certain impressions. There's like a felt sense when you're in a secondary state. But that felt sense, again, it's just a sense. Your senses can be somewhat off. And yes, this could all be your subconscious fucking with you, even though I don't think that's true. I'll leave it here. My first consciously induced OBE. think so. There are people here. I'm shocked that there are people here for this one. I really want to try DMT. I've tried, there's a herbal one. What is Sativa Divitorium? I've always been somewhat freaked out by using meds like that. Because my thought was, if there's a way to hit those states without doing that, then I kind of want to try that. There are ways to hit those states without that. I mean, the OBE stuff, to me, was the most direct route into a secondary state. I mean, lucid dreaming is one thing, so fair enough. I mean, the moment that you're lucid within a dream state, you can call for other things. But reaching the state where you haven't lost a breaking consciousness, to me, always felt like, well, if I'm awake, then I'm awake, then I'm awake. What I'm experiencing here is what I'm experiencing. And now, I would make an argument that I don't quite understand people who say, well, what happens in the dream state is just the dream state. And what happens here? They're making an assumption that they have a body as if this is a solid thing, as opposed to being a consciousness that creates a body. When you're in a dream state, you could be looking at the stars, you can be looking at the moon, you could be talking to your wife, your girlfriend, your lover, you could be having sexual experiences, you could be thinking about what you're going to eat for dinner, you could be looking at all of these things. All of these things you're taking as if they're external from you. Understand what I mean? In that moment, you're taking as if all of the stuff is external from you. It's outside of me. Well, it's not really. All of that stuff at that point is you, because if you do have a body in which your brain is encased in, all of those things, all of those beliefs, those thoughts, and everything else is taking place inside of you. Here's the catch. Anything that your brain gives you, or anything that you experience in your outer reality, meaning your waking state, you can experience in a non-waking state. Your brain is encased in your skull. It gets electrical impulses. As long as it gets a particular electrical impulse or spoofs the electrical impulse in and of itself, you can experience that particular thing. We make assumptions, however, kind of like the character in a video game, that character is solid and that the world around them is solid and everything else. It is possible that just like in your dream state, where you have all of these experiences and everything else, and all of these things look like they're coming from outside of you, look like they're third person, and you are an individual, and you're looking outside of your eyes, missing the point that, really, all of those things are happening inside of you. There is no third person in that process. It's all you. We assume that we are a body that have a consciousness, as opposed to having a consciousness that produces a body. It's possible that the dream state and that particular perspective of the dream state is just the way things are. Meaning that dream state is a state in and of itself. And in this case, your waking state of reality, when you pursue and go about your affairs, that the same thing is taking place, where consciousness is producing a body in this case, where the way you're interacting with the stuff, it comes across from your experiential reality as if everything is solid. And if you measure the universe is there. It's a growing and evolving universe. It's the reason our scientific processes and everything else work. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you're a consciousness with a body within that context, if that makes sense, or a body that's a consciousness. We look at our dream states and we act as if, okay, that's something different. We also make an assumption that your dream state is only you. That's the other part. This notion that potentially a consciousness that has a body, that you're plugged into a particular system that kind of, puts you out into this process. The people who are doing the lucid dream states or the OBE states are like turning a dial of the consciousness to end up in a particular spot, if that makes sense. Some of these people who are doing this OBE stuff, they recount so amazing things, like the interacting with other beings of stuff or other planes that are similar to this in pretty much every other way, with slight deviations. Like in those cases, my thing is, well, look, the problem with all of this is that you end up stuck with, this is what I experienced. Tom Campbell, and some of the research that he was doing with the other guy, they were doing OBE states together in order to kind of show whether you can have a same experience, when you can be with somebody else in that state and have a similar experience. Like they were doing a lot of research into that type of stuff. But oftentimes when people are doing OBE stuff, they're by themselves. I mean, the Monroe Institute talks a lot about it. But my issue with that is, or the point with that is, then you're kind of stuck with this kind of subjective reality. And that anybody else who you're talking to, unless they've experienced something like that, are stuck either believing you or disbelieving you, which either case, they're in the same spot. They're stuck in this notion of belief. It plagues me when I have a conversation with my wife sometime, and I tell her, I say, look, I experienced this, this, and this. And I know that she's stuck in this place of, that's interesting. That's all she can say. She can say, okay, I think you're on something, or she can say, okay, you might have experienced it, fair enough. She can even say, I don't think you're lying to me, so yeah, I believe that what you're saying about that. But it is impossible to give her the gravity or even how it digs into you without her encountering it herself. When she went to the Monroe Institute with me, I was so hoping that when we were doing the meditative stuff that she was going to be like, you'll never believe what happened. Recently that has happened because she's created like a little meditation room, and she's had a weird experience where she's like, you'll never believe what happened. I was like, no, look who you're talking to. But the altered states, the OBE stuff is fucking fascinating, man. And to see some of those guys try to explain what they're encountering, and at the end of the day, you know that when Tom Campbell goes and tries to explain this kind of the larger consciousness system, that's the way he talks about it. He's a physicist. He's an astrophysicist. So he talks about this stuff in those terms. The problem with this is Tom Campbell's model of that stuff is just based on how he thinks himself. It's subjective. It's hard to kind of get it across. And even this notion of real, like we think of a real in the sense of waking consciousness. But that's not necessarily, or if somebody else can experience what you're experiencing in that moment, if that makes sense. If three of us are here and we see a bus coming, all of us agree that there's a bus coming. All right, fair enough. That's reality. That's why we look at that stuff. But that's not necessarily the end all and be all. That's just necessarily the way we see it. I don't know. Like I said, this show doesn't necessarily have answers per se. And any weird experience, honestly, just ends up with more questions. Like, what is this? What does that mean? What is the outcome of that? I've had people who are staunch Christians who had OBs who shocked the shit out of me and some of the recounting of it. One guy, he said he was praying, and apparently he was like really into his prayers or whatever, and he finds himself out of his body looking at his body, and he's further away looking at it. There's nothing in his experience to explain it. So for him, he doesn't know what this is. He just thinks Jesus has ripped him out of his body. That's his perspective. And he's looking at his body, and he's startled. Like, he's like, oh my God. And he starts pleading for Jesus to put him back in his body, in which case he falls back in his body. Now, the catch is, it wasn't Jesus. He probably had gotten into a meditative state just, in his prayers or whatever. And he ends up in this kind of weird brain state where he's out. And when you freak out, you crash back into your body. You're not going to lose your body. In this case, he crashed back into his body because he freaked out. He never knew what that was. He had no idea what that was. It freaked him out even to this date, and he was talking about this took place like 10 years ago. And I was trying to explain it to him, but religious people sometimes have a very specific context of the world. And so it's like you're trying to tell them something that's not Jesus, or that's not, angels, or whatever. So it's, yeah. There was no sense of not being able to breathe. I could see myself in the water. I looked at the lens flare coming off the water. Oh, you had one in a garden. Really? Garden is an experiencer? Wow. Badass. The funny part, Sam Harris. The atheist Sam Harris is even into stuff like this, where he's talking about brain states and all this other stuff. It leads you to interesting places when you start analyzing it. The fact of the matter is, again, it's not this is what reality is. It's more so, it's interesting that this is an aspect of reality, if that makes sense. Even when you get into some of the experiments that these guys were doing, the the double slit. I've done this in the video before. This notion that consciousness interacts with the reality itself. Some of the noetics experiments that they were doing, showing how consciousness can have these like minor tweaks and probabilistic outcomes and effects in our waking reality state. Tom Campbell right now is doing an experiment where he's trying to demonstrate that consciousness is kind of an aspect of reality. And he's trying to use the double slit experiment in a way that takes out all notion of doubt that physicists can hide behind. More so to say that your explanation of this, that this is not consciousness interacting with reality, doesn't hold true. With this notion of trying to force them to kind of go to the table of, okay, maybe that's true. Keep in mind, quantum mechanics wasn't something that these guys loved. Quantum mechanics was something that was thrust upon Einstein, like the relativistic people. Einstein was like, this is playing dice with the universe. It's because they understood the probabilistic effects that was built and inherent into quantum mechanics. And they was like, oh my God, they're ripping our classical universe apart. Various pillars of this stuff was undermined. It is true that if you're talking about just local effects, that for the most part, classical mechanics plays out, but relativistic effects, and at certain points, especially when you're talking about minor distances, quantum mechanistic effects, they break down when you're getting at large distances. But when you're talking about just minor distances, the universe is a very strange place. I'll leave it here. The first few minutes of this will be here. The remainder will be on Black Box. Thanks all. Have a good night. Oh, by the way, I'll be on Fault Lines in the morning.